Et je vais accueillir, ça me fait plaisir d'accueillir le professeur Rajesh Rao, ici à Montréal. Voilà. Welcome, Montreal. As I said, I'll introduce you in French and then I'll briefly introduce you in English. Professeur Rao et un instant. Voilà. Il est professeur de la chaire de CJ et Elisabeth Wang en informatique et génie et en génie électronique ainsi qu'informatique à l'Université de Washington à Seattle. Il est le coproposant avec Dana Ballard, que je connaissais aussi à cette époque, du modèle de codage prédictif du fonctionnement cérébral en 1999, le codage prédictif qui est devenu beaucoup plus répandu dans d'autres domaines. Il est co-directeur du Center for Neurotechnology et directeur du Neural Systems Laboratory là, à l'Université de Washington. Ses recherches couvrent les neurosciences computationnelles, les interfaces cerveau-machine et l'intelligence artificielle. Il va nous parler du codage prédictif, évidemment, et modèles génératifs dans l'intelligence naturelle et artificielle. I'm very happy to, I'm not going to repeat all of this in English, but I'm very happy to welcome Raj Rao to Montreal, so to speak, at the University of Washington, Seattle, with an endowed chair from the details about the endowment. It's something in Huang.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have it at the tip of your tongue?
Yeah, the CG and Elizabeth Wang and professorship, yeah.
That's
so
it.
yeah.
And he will be speaking about predictive coding and generative models in natural and artificial intelligence. He is, in fact, a computational neuroscientist, although he doesn't do anything with live heads except EEG. Welcome, Raj, and it's yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Stephen, and really appreciate the invitation and this opportunity to interact with everyone at Montreal and beyond. If you have any questions, feel free to, I think, if it's a clarifying question, I'll be happy to answer them during the talk. And then I think I was told there's going to be more opportunity for interaction and discussion later, so that's fine as well. But I really, I'm happy to be here. So what I'll do today is give you an overview of some of the ideas. Some of them are older ideas that began when I was a graduate student with Dana Ballard. Some of them are newer ideas that we've been exploring, and they're all in this realm of predictive coding, which is a theory that has gained a lot of popularity in recent years, both in cognitive science and in neuroscience. And I also try to connect that to generative models and potential connections to AI and the recent interest in generative models in AI. So let's begin with the question that originally motivated me and my advisor, Dana Ballard. And this is the puzzle of the neocortex. So the neocortex, right, there's certain very intriguing features, we can call them organizational principles, which is that, any particular area of the neocortex, as shown on the left side here, any particular area has the 6-layered structure. And what we see there is a particular organization of how these neurons in the 6 layers are connected to each other, as well as the kind of inputs and outputs they send to other cortical areas and other regions of the brain. So there seems to be, a diversity in function. So there's different areas that we all know process information about vision or audition. There's certain areas that we know, like the motor cortex, that generate motor commands. But they all seem to share this particular kind of organizational structure of a laminar structure of 6 layers and particular patterns of inputs and outputs. There's also evidence of flexibility in terms of what these areas can do. So in one of the famous experiments several years ago, by Mrigankar and colleagues showed that if you divert the information from the optic nerve to the auditory cortex, so auditory cortex we always thought would process auditory information only, right, and learn particular properties necessary for auditory perception. Mrigankar and colleagues showed that now the auditory cortex, once it receives visual information from the optic nerve, can start to develop receptive field properties that are essential for processing visual information. And then indeed, they showed that the animal can even use the auditory cortex in terms of visual tasks. So it was actually a functional system in terms of what it was receiving in terms of visual information and then performing a visual task. So that again is evidence of the flexibility of this cortical module or cortical algorithm, if you could call it that. So the big question that that everybody was interested in was, is there a common computational principle operating across cortex? And this goes back to Vernon Mountcastle's work, in terms of cortical columns. There's other people that I've listed here that have suggested perhaps that there is something going on across cortical areas that could be common, despite the fact that these areas receive different kinds of inputs and send their outputs to different areas. Perhaps they're all operating under a common computational principle. So what exactly is that principle, right? So going back to traditional models, this has been going on, I think, since perhaps William James and other psychologists, is this idea of a feed-forward model of how, cognition or behavior happens, which is typically the back of the cortex, this back of this backside, that's where you have perception. So you actually process inputs and so on. That's the traditional model. And then there's a decision that happens perhaps in the frontal lobes. And then that decision is then conveyed to the motor cortex or the motor regions. And then you essentially move and act. So this particular kind of trajectory, this kind of process input, make decision, and move and act has been, I would say, a dogma of a lot of textbooks, and we've actually grown up believing this particular kind of model. And in fact, it's so popular that even AI actually followed this paradigm, going back to neural networks and more recently deep neural networks, which take an input and then they process each layer of the deep neural network, computes more features, more aspects or properties of the inputs until you come to the last stage where you have an action, which is classification in one case, so cat or a dog given an input. Even the more recent transformer neural networks, you can look at them as essentially taking inputs and then computing one stage after another of the self-attention, and then keep processing it until you get to some output probabilities for the next token or the next word. So in some sense, even this is like a feed-forward, step-by-step processing of the input all the way to some outputs. But if you look at the anatomy of the cortex, what you'll find is that every stage that we can call feed-forward, so for example, the primary visual cortex, or V1, this blue arrow shows some of the feed-forward connections. So V1 to V2 is an example of a feed-forward connection. Each of these feed-forward connections in blue, they're reciprocated by a feedback connection. So each feed-forward connection has a corresponding feedback connection from V2 back to V1, for example, right? So this is a very interesting aspect of cortical anatomy. So it's not really a feed-forward sort of bucket brigade kind of V1 to V2 to V4 to temporal lobe to IT and so on. There is this feedback connection for every particular stage of the visual system, which is an interesting aspect that we need to acknowledge as we develop an understanding of the cortex. So back in the late 90s, when I was a graduate student with Dana Ballard, we were looking at this particular aspect of the cortex, and we were also looking at some phenomena such as, how does context of what's in the surrounding area of a receptive field in the visual cortex affect what's in the center? So there were these center surround properties that we were trying to explain. So we came up with this particular model, which we call predictive coding, because there's already evidence for this kind of predictive coding in the retina and in the lateral geniculate nucleus. So we said, okay, if the cortex is actually doing predictive coding, what would that look like? And we drew inspiration from engineering and from control theory. So there's a whole field in control theory, looking at feedback control. And there's also very famous algorithms like the Kalman filter is a very famous algorithm that was even used to land the lunar module on the moon. So we were inspired by the Kalman filter, and we suggested this kind of a architecture where the feedback connections we suggested were carrying the predictions or anticipation of a particular area of the cortex, and the feed-forward connections would then carry the error signal or the difference or deviation between the input that actually came in and the prediction of the input from some circuit within a cortical area that is computing those predictions. And then the interesting thing was that the dynamics of this recurrent circuit, you could show mathematically that it can minimize the prediction errors. And that was the main, I would say, insight that we had, was the fact that you could have a neural network that had the architecture of feed-forward and feedback connections. And that would, when you implement that as a neural circuit, as a recurrent neural circuit, it could implement essentially a minimization of the prediction errors. So that's the loss function that it minimizes. And we also showed you could learn some receptive fields that are very similar to the kinds of receptive fields or features that you find in the visual cortex. So that was the original 1999 Nature Neuroscience paper. There was other papers that are related, including some more recent papers that we've published. So the broader picture here is that this circuit and this particular predictive coding algorithm, it implements Bayesian inference. So I'll just go into a really quick overview of Bayesian inference. So what do we mean by Bayesian inference? So this goes back to Reverend Thomas Bayes, right? So he was a nonconformist minister back in the 1700s. And his first publication was this one, right? So Divine Benevolence, or an attempt to prove that the principal end of the divine providence and government is the happiness of his creatures. So I usually ask in my class, okay, what exactly is this publication all about? And so there's many different guesses, but I think the clue is divine, right? So it is all about the fact that Bayes was trying to prove that God is actually a kind God who's trying to, make sure that his creatures, which is us and animals, are happy, right? So that was the original, publication, the very first publication, I would say, of Thomas Bayes. Unfortunately, if you look at Google Scholar, for example, not many citations, right? So, but then he's known for this publication, which actually was published after he had passed away. And this is the essay towards solving a problem in the doctrine of chances. And this is where the famous Bayes theorem was introduced. This was actually published by his friend, Price, Mr. Price here. And so what exactly is Bayes theorem or Bayesian inference? In fact, before we go to that, I just wanted to say that even this picture of Bayes is supposed to be, there's uncertainty, right? Uncertainty surrounding even this picture. So that's just a theme that pervades, Bayesian inference here. So moving on to Bayes' theorem, what exactly is that and what is Bayesian inference? It's actually a very, I would say, powerful way of thinking about perception or even any kind of agent that is interacting with the world. You're always going to enter a situation with some prior belief about what is going to happen. So that is this P of X is some probability distribution over some random variable X. So when you entered, this Zoom room or your actual room in Quebec, you may have come with some kind of belief about what this talk was about. And then as I'm speaking and as I'm giving my talk, you're going to be, getting input information. That's the new information that's coming in. Hopefully things you have not heard about before, which are interesting. And then what you're going to end up with, hopefully after you, go through this talk is, you'll find some way of combining this prior belief and new information. Maybe you'll agree with me in some cases, you will not agree with me in other cases. But Bayes' theorem gives you a way of combining new information with prior belief, right? And that's this mathematical, very simple kind of conditional probability definition, which is that you take the new information. So this first term is called the likelihood, right? Probability of the input given some hidden random state that you're trying to estimate. And then there's a prior belief about the state. And then there's a normalization at the bottom. But then you just multiply these two and you get what is called the posterior belief or posterior probability of whatever you are trying to estimate, right? This X is the hidden state that you don't know, but you're getting some new information about it from the external world here. And that's a simple mathematical formula, but it's a way to combine your prior beliefs with new information. So that's basically all it is. It's just a mathematical, rigorous way of combining prior belief with new information. And you can repeat this many, many times. You can do this recursively, right? So you can keep computing your posterior beliefs, and that becomes your prior for the next time step or the next situation. You get more new information. Again, you compute your prior beliefs and you posterior beliefs, and you keep doing that over and over again. And that essentially is Bayesian inference over time. So I'll just motivate that with this example. So I guess if anybody know who this person is in the image, you can raise your hand if or you can just, I guess, maybe wave or something, right? If you know who this is. If you don't know, then I'm going to give you more clues, right? So at this point, it may be very hard for you to know who this is, but if I give you more clues, like, okay, the year, right?
We
So
have a hypothesis. Just a second.
Well, I just guess.
Okay, don't say it out loud. Just keep it in your mind if you guess who it is, right? But for those of you who don't know who it is, then here's more clues, right? So what you're doing now is you're combining this likelihood, the new information that just came in with your prior belief. So you may have come in with some biases because you know what this particular symposium is about in terms of the anniversary, right? But basically, if I give you more information, so here's the nose, right? And eventually I give you the mouth. This should give you very good information now. Your posterior beliefs are very, very narrow or have been sharpened, right? For the individual. And of course, now it's Turing. So this is the 75th anniversary. So I thought it was pretty appropriate for us to celebrate that 75th anniversary of the Turing test, right? So again, I'm honored to be a part of that effort in terms of the symposium. So that gives you an idea of how you can accumulate evidence. And as you're accumulating new evidence, you can update your posterior probability or posterior beliefs. And that's how you can then move forward and take actions, right? There's a whole bunch of work people have done. I've just listed some from the late 90s and early 2000s showing that Bayesian models can explain a lot of really interesting illusions, psychophysical phenomena, and other kinds of cognitive phenomena. And one of the ones that I like a lot is this first one, the motion from cast shadows by Kirsten et al. And here's a video of that. Some of you may have already seen this, but what I'm going to show is this video where this ball over here, the blue ball, is going to go along exactly the same trajectory along the bottom of this patterned floor. What's going to change is this shadow, right? So just by changing the shadow, your brain is going to construct a completely different percept, right? So let's give that a try. So here's, oops, sorry. Let me see if I can get that going. May have to go back to just there we go. There's the first one, and then the second one, right? So this keeps repeating. So you can see how the ball, right, is going exactly the same trajectory, but what's changing is the shadows. In one case, the shadow is right below it. The other case, the shadow is going in this direction. And you're almost, your brain constructs this 3D percept of this ball's motion, right? So I hope you can see that difference between the two, right? So why is this happening? Well, if you look at their paper, Kirsten et al. Show that a very simple model explains this, which is, if you think about it, what is the brain really doing? It's making some assumptions. It's assuming that there's an illumination source. And in this case, it's assuming the illumination source is above the object, which makes sense. And it's also assuming that the illumination source is stationary. So you could have explained this by having the illumination source also moving. But the brain assumes that the illumination source is stationary and it's above this particular scene. And if you think about it a little bit, does that make sense? Well, think about evolution, right? So evolutionarily, that's an ecologically valid assumption because obviously we have our friendly star, right, that is providing the illumination, and we've evolved making that assumption that the illumination source is always overhead. And that the illumination source, the sun, is stationary, right? So that makes sense. So that's the kind of explanation you can give if you assume this kind of a Bayesian model where the prior beliefs are based on, in this case, ecologically reasonable assumptions. Here's some other examples. So this is the famous Kaniza triangle. So we all see a white triangle here, even though there isn't really a line in any of these gaps that you see here, right? You can basically see that the brain constructs this triangle here, even though there isn't actual lines defining this particular triangle. And again, that's this notion of, okay, your brain comes up with priors about what is out there based on all the different natural, things it has encountered in the natural world. And then the other one is this one here, where if you look at the central dotted, stimulus, you'll say, okay, it's A, B, and C. But if I just change the context, what is in the surrounding area, like I make it like this, now your brain interprets this as 13, right? Even though it's the same stimulus, your interpretation changes according to what is in the surrounding context. So again, it's this idea that you can come up with some prior expectations based on the information you're given, either temporal information or spatial information. In this case, it's the spatial information of the surrounding region or surrounding stimuli. And again, it's this notion of a top-down, a bias or a prior that's coming in. All right, so this leads to what has been called the Bayesian brain hypothesis. And this is the idea that the brain learns an internal model, and this is basically a generative model, right? It's a generative model of the world. And we're all learning that. We learned that, I mean, we get born with some prior architectural constraints and so on. And even in the connectome, we have some biases there. But then after you're born, you start to pick up from your environment. And so the idea is that you learn this internal model of the world, but you also use the model in some kind of an approximate Bayesian inference. We don't fully know yet how Bayesian it is, but it's a way to estimate the most probable or the likely causes of your sensory input, right? And that's one of the ideas behind a Bayesian brain is you only get access to your sensory inputs. And so you're trying to guess or make a best guess as to what is causing those sensory inputs. And this is just a cartoon that tries to illustrate, okay, the real world is out here. You have access to only a 2D projection in the case of vision, but you can move around, you can move your eyes and so on. But then ultimately what you want is some kind of a internal model, and maybe you're estimating certain parameters. I mean, you're not really constructing a full 3D model, but in this case, I'm just showing some of the parameters. But you can think of it as, depending on the task, you're estimating some hidden parameters of the world by using your sensory inputs and making some assumptions based on your internal model of the world, right? So that's kind of the idea. And there's a couple of books that I was involved in co-editing with my co-editors here, if you're interested. And this is, going back to the early or mid-2000s. So going back to the predictive coding model, what we suggested was, we said, okay, the visual hierarchy, the visual cortex has this approximate hierarchy. We just looked at V1, V2, V4, and IT as, interacting with the lateral geniculate nucleus and the thalamus. And then, of course, retina sends its information to the lateral geniculate nucleus. And so we attempted to model this kind of a feed-forward feedback architecture based on this idea that the feedback connections are carrying predictions or expectations, and feed-forward connections are carrying error signals. And that happens with every cortical area. So every cortical area has access to its local error signal, and every cortical area computes predictions of what's happening in a preceding cortical area. And overall, right, if you try to minimize these errors, that's what the dynamics of this whole network is doing. It basically ends up learning abstract representations from V1, V2, and so on that are increasingly more and more abstract. So V1 would be edge detectors, like similar to Hubel and Wiesel's, kinds of edge and bar detectors or Gabor filters. But as you go to the higher areas, you start to see more complex combinations of features like corners and so on, all the way up to IT, where you start to see things that look more like, face features and so on, or more complex objects representation. So that you could do with this kind of an architecture. And the bottom line is that the inference, which is basically the dynamics of this network, minimizes prediction errors. But even on a longer time, like a slower time scale, the learning, which is changing the synaptic weights of these feed-forward feedback connections, as well as recurrent connections within each cortical area, is also minimizing the prediction errors. So there's two different ways in which you can minimize prediction errors. One is inference, which is very fast. It happens with the dynamics. The other is learning, which is slow. It happens by changing the synaptic weights of the network. And I'll sort of conclude this section by just mentioning that in 2018, AI discovered prediction errors as a great way to train transformers, right? So if you look at all the GPTs, the chat GPT is based on these transformers. They're all training these networks now, these very huge multi-billion, parameter networks using this idea of next token prediction. So you give tokens which are extracted from language or videos, and then you compute a probability, or in this case, a softmax distribution or output of what the next token should be, and then you compare it to the actual next token, and then you compute the prediction error, and you do back propagation to change the weights of all of these particular weights in the network, in this decoder transformer, right? And so it's become a very dominant way of training using what they're calling self-supervised learning, but it's essentially the same idea we also suggested for predictive coding, was this idea that the brain can use predictions and prediction errors as a way to train the weights of the network. And it can go even beyond that, not just train the weights. It can also use prediction errors to do inference. Similar to the Kalman filter, it can basically do filtering, or it can do estimation of the hidden state of the world using prediction errors. So just a quick note on that connection to current AI training architectures. There's also been a lot of interest in predictive coding in recent years. So this is just showing that we published the paper in Nature Neuroscience back in 1999. Not many citations from Google Scholar. And this was like almost 10 years, right? There's hardly any citations. But then it certainly took off in the 2010s and 11s, and then it's even growing right now. So every year, when I get a chance and I look at it at the end of the year, there is like an increase in the number of citations, and a bunch of citations shown here. There's also books that have come out on predictions and in the cortex or in the brain, and predictive coding and prediction errors and so on. So there's a lot of interest in predictive coding. And of course, Carl Friston has been quite instrumental also in pushing forward predictive coding and his free energy principle, which is basically using predictive coding to minimize free energy as a principle for brain function. So I like to give this example as to encourage graduate students and young researchers to say, hey, you may publish something and not see anybody citing it for a long time, but still keep some hope. Right, in the future, there may be something that happens, like, for example, new technologies to test your theory, or new ideas that come up, and maybe you'll start getting more citations in the future. So don't lose hope yet.
Raj, I have a question.
Yeah. I think that's a good time to just ask some clarifying questions. So yeah, go ahead.
It's invited from everybody. I'm just going to ask a little one.
Sure.
Is it really informative to say that it's a kind of self-supervised learning? I think that if there's a principle behind the idea of predictive feedback from meeting of predictions, it's not self-supervised, because it's the consequences of the so it's really much more a special form of reinforcement learning than some other category.
Yeah, it's a great distinction you're making there in terms of, what do we mean by self-supervised? And, you can look at it as, the reason why in machine learning and AI, they call it self-supervised is because, the traditional deep learning networks were trained with labels, like human labels and so on. That was supervised learning. And here, you don't need a label. You're just using the inputs themselves, right? So the inputs are coming in, and then you're looking at the errors, and errors are a way to then change the weights and learn a model of the world. So that's, I think, the self-supervised learning terminology.
Same thing can be said about labeling. Labeling is just batch supervision.
Yeah, so I agree. I think that you can basically talk about, okay, what do we mean by supervision, right? So I think it comes down to this idea of the brain, that at least in most of its learning, right? You can maybe call it unsupervised, right? It does not require actual like a teacher telling you what to do, right? It can just use the inputs it's getting. What it can do is it can perform actions. I haven't gotten to that yet, but you can do experiments on your own, which is you can take actions, look at the consequences of actions, and then use the error from those consequences to then update your model of what happens when you perform a particular action. And that includes rewards. So you mentioned reinforcement. So typically you can perform an action, see, hey, did it benefit me in some way? Perhaps I got a reward and so on. But so that is part of the reinforcement learning loop. And we would call that model-based reinforcement learning. What we're talking about here is the model part, right? So how do we learn this model of the world, which is the generative model of the world? It includes rewards. So you can use the rewards to learn, especially you can learn the policy or the action to take to get you more reward. But you can also think of it in terms of, okay, the model part is distinct from the reinforcement part, right, which is a reward-based learning. The model part is more of an exploration of the world, and you learn through interactions with the world and so on. So that's the kind of distinction I'm making here, but it's a good point to raise, I think, to think about. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Anyone else? Now's your chance. Here, or raise your hand if you're far away.
Yeah, there's time at the end as well. If I can always go back to these slides towards the end if there's questions. But the point here I wanted to make was, okay, so this is great that there's interest in predictive coding, and we're talking about predictions and error signals and so on. But if you look at what really we're doing as humans or even animals are doing, is it's not really a pure, you take an image, you try to predict it, and take the prediction errors. Really, it's this active kind of interaction. So in the case of vision, we're doing these eye movements, which are about 3 per second, right, on average. And so we're actively exploring the visual world in this case. And in fact, as shown by Yarbus back in 1967, the kind of eye movements you make depends on the question you're asking. So if I ask you, estimate how wealthy the people are in this painting, you're going to make this kind of an eye movement where you're looking at the faces or their dress, or their, what they're wearing and so on, or what's on their walls. But if you say estimate their ages, how old are these people in this painting, a lot more eye movements are made, like fixations are made on the faces of the people. Okay, what color is their hair or their beard and things like that, right? And the same thing for here's when you have a face image, you again make a lot of eye movements towards the eyes, the nose, and so on, and hardly any eye movements to the forehead, right? So forehead doesn't get that many eye movements. But I think this particular example illustrates that perception is not static, right? So it's not like the traditional sort of deep learning or even the current visual transformer model where you throw the whole image with all kinds of complex objects in it to the network or the, and then you try to compute, label each object or segment each object and label each object in the image. Really what we're doing as humans is we're very selective on what we pick and send through our optic nerves to the cortex, right? So we're sending to the cortex is obviously involved as well, but we have some mechanism to figure out where to look, and then that is allowing us to bring in information. Think of this as, some people like to call this overt attention, right? So it's basically like an attention mechanism, but that's just a word, right? What we're really doing is moving our body, in this case, our eyes. But in general, you can move your head, you can move your eyes, you can even move your entire body. Most animals will move their entire body and orient themselves towards things that are of interest or that are alarming, or that orientation is very strong, right, in terms of perception. And so this is where I think I'd like to step back and think of, okay, what do we mean by intelligence, right? So for me, intelligence really speaks to the primacy of actions. And this goes back to, so I'm going to use some ideas from Paul Chisek's talk. So Paul has done some great work. He's actually from Montreal. He and many others have suggested that, okay, if you look evolutionarily, what happened is, initially you may have been trying to, maintain some, homeostasis within, a single cell, for example, right? And you could use chemistry, right? You could use metabolic control to, make sure the nutrients or the temperature is maintained within a particular, in this case, a single cell. But later on, as you have more, let's say, your needs go beyond what you can do yourself, right? What you can generate yourself through chemistry, through biochemistry, and maybe the nutrients are now outside your body or your, the organism. Then that's where movement becomes important. And so then you have to control how you move towards where the nutrients are and grab the nutrient. And that's this illustration here again from Paul's example. And then more broadly speaking, you can think of this cycle of, there's some impetus. This is the, some people call this a drive, right? So let's say it's a hunger drive. So now your nutrient level is going low. So, you have a nutrient state that says, okay, I need more nutrients. You're getting hungry. And then what we're calling intelligence in this case is basically where do I go? So what is the action to take such that when I go to that new location, for example, the outcome of the action, the required nutrient state has to be satisfied by the current nutrient state. So maybe you go to a location and then you eat, right? You get the reward, you get the food, you eat, and that'll placate this drive, this required nutrient state. And so the prediction error, if you want to call it that, right? Initially, the prediction error, right, was big. But then once you take actions, the error signal is going to go down. So again, it's this idea of minimizing your prediction errors. I mean, prediction in this case is essentially saying, if I move there, then I'm going to reduce the error signal in my hunger, right? In this case, the impetus is going to go away once I, get to some particular new state of the environment. So that's kind of the motivation. So the bottom line that I like to suggest here, and it's in line with people like Buzaki and Linnaeus and Powers and Carl Friston, is that intelligence may have evolved to control the body. So there is an essential embodiment. Some people call it embodied cognition, but that's basically this embodied intelligence idea, is that the evolution may have developed, this notion that we call intelligence, to move towards desirable conditions and move away from undesirable, noxious stimuli or predators and things like that, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind, is this notion of actions or movements being pretty closely tied to what we're calling intelligence. And then there's some really interesting evidence, physiological data from mice. So this is the mouse brain, showing that if you look at the cortex in particular, and there's a task that the mice are doing, which is they're deciding, it's a decision-making task. They're looking at some grating stimuli, visual stimuli, and they have to make a left versus right choice. This is the motor action. So when they're before they actually make this choice, so there's two different sets of trial. One is a go where they make the movement, other is a no-go where they don't make a movement. In the case where they are about to make a movement, you start to see, even before they make the movement, pretty much all of the cortex getting activated, right? So in fact, if you look at 25 milliseconds before the animal makes an action, you look at a action decoder accuracy. So can I decode whether the animal is going to make that action or motor movement or not? Any area of the cortex, a whole bunch of areas of the cortex, is dark regions. You can use them to make a pretty high prediction of the animal's movement based on the cortical neural activity across the animal's cortex, right? So the data seems to suggest some kind of a predictive updating of cortical representations before the action takes place. So, and some people have suggested maybe it's through an efference copy or a corollary discharge that goes from the motor execution saying, hey, I'm going to make this movement now. It goes back to the cortex to tell cortex, hey, expect to see some kind of a sensory signal coming in, and maybe it can learn to predict that sensory signal that's going to come in when you make an action, right? So that's the idea here. And the other intriguing evidence comes from anatomical data. So if you again go back to the 6 layers of the cortex, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of cortical areas, what you'll notice is that in most of the areas, the sensory or so-called sensory inputs from for example, the lateral genicular nucleus comes to the middle layers of the cortex. In the case of motor cortex, there's not much of a middle layer, but it does come to the superficial layers of the cortex, sensory information. But then the deeper layers, so layers 5 and 6, send outputs, especially layer 5 sends outputs to motor regions that are evolutionarily older, right? So these are fundamental motor structures in the brain, and the layer 5 seems to be sending outputs to those areas. So in fact, even primary sensory cortex like V1, which primary visual cortex sends outputs to the superior colliculus. Primary auditory cortex, A1, sends outputs to inferior colliculus, and then somatosensory cortex, S1, sends outputs to the spinal cord, right? So this is a pretty interesting observation to make here, is that even the primary sensory areas seem to be sending information to motor centers. So the question is why? Why are they so tightly connected to motor outputs, right? So this is where we make a connection to control theory and reinforcement learning. So if you are familiar with reinforcement learning, for example, typically there's 2 different components to any agent that you're building. So one is called a world model, and that's basically the state transition function or the dynamics function, which says, given a particular state of the world at time t, you can take an action at that point in time, and it predicts what the next state should be. So there's a state prediction component. And then once you estimate the state of the world or predict the state of the world, there's something called the policy function, which is an action selection function, which selects the best action you can take that will optimize something, right? So it could be optimizing an expected reward in the reinforcement learning case. Maybe you're optimizing or minimizing a loss function. So it could be some kind of a function. That's how you would choose the next action. And then you have this cycle going between the agent and the world, and you get to sample the world. You can get to see what the next state of the world is, and you update your state, and then you keep doing that over and over again. So that's the traditional model for, from control theory or from reinforcement learning. And so what we suggested was mapping that particular architecture onto the 6-layered architecture of the cortex. So any cortical area has a 6-layer structure. These arrows are indicative of connections between different layers, so neurons in different layers of the cortex, and also inputs to those layers and outputs from the layers. So layer 5 sending outputs to motor centers like the superior colliculus or inferior colliculus or spinal cord, and so on, and also to the thalamus that's in between the cortex and some sensory areas. And so we suggested this kind of a mapping as a first attempt, which is you can map the state transition function to the superficial layers. So that's where you get sensory inputs. You're trying to maintain some state estimates. And then the deeper layers could be implementing the policy function or the action function, right? So that would be the one particular mapping. And there's also connections going from the deeper layers back to the superficial layers, and that's given by this dashed line. So that's like an efference copy or that corollary discharge I mentioned, which is if you suggest an action, then a copy of that action command goes back to the state transition function to make the next prediction of what to expect when you take an action. And then there's also a decoder that can be used to compare your predicted state, right? Convert that into an input, and then you can get a prediction error from this input prediction that you make, and that input error, the prediction error, can be used to update the state of the network at this level, and also change the weights at a longer time scale, right? And then finally, this action, right, that we're suggesting, how do you learn the actions for any particular situation? So you could learn it either through planning. So you have a model of the world up here, so you can predict the consequences of your actions at the top. And you can select the actions and learn a policy function that way, or you could use reinforcement learning to maximize your expected reward. And so then it becomes like a model-based reinforcement learning approach, right? So there's two different ways in which, in this case, this model can learn actions or action sequences. So the world model that you'll hear about in AI, there's a lot of buzz about world models nowadays. That is captured by the state transition function, where there's an action you have to take with the current state, and that predicts the next state. And that's the dynamics of the world, the physics of the world that you're modeling by learning this function or the state transition function FS, right? And remember that this is just for one cortical area. So now we have to also think about, okay, what does it mean to have this same kind of model replicated across many different areas of the cortex, and how do they interact with each other when each of the areas is computing something like this, with respect to their own inputs or modalities that they're receiving, the inputs that they're receiving. So here's how it is implemented in terms of inference and learning, right? So inference means you get input, so you get feedback. Every time you take an action, you get some feedback about what the consequence of the action was, as well as you get a feedback in terms of what action was selected. So if different cortical areas are sending suggested actions, then only one of them gets selected. So where to move your eyes, for example, and that feedback also comes back to the cortical areas to say, hey, look, the action you suggested may not have been executed. So there's a competition between actions, and some other action was selected. So then change your predictions, right? So that's this particular component here. And so inference involves updating your state and your actions using prediction errors. And then learning involves using the same prediction errors and possibly rewards, right? The dopaminergic inputs to cortical areas could be used to change these policy functions that selects the actions for any particular, situation or context or task. So that's kind of the idea here is these hats over here over each of these functions are learned estimates, and these hats over here are the estimates based on sensory inputs that you get. And the last thing I'll end in terms of the architectural, motivation here is this idea of hierarchies, right? So why do we need a hierarchy? So you can think of it in terms of a very purely computational motivation, which is, if you have a very complex problem you're trying to solve, like going to the grocery store to buy some milk, for example, then it typically involves a bunch of, sub tasks that you're doing, like in my case, I have to walk to the door of the house and go to the car garage, get the car, and so on. You may, like if you want to do public transportation, you can think of the particular subtasks you have to solve to get to the market. But each of these in turn has subtasks, and eventually you get to the point where, you know, if it's getting into the car, it would be opening the car door, closing the car door, and so on. And this would all involve very detailed, you know, eventually muscle movements, right? So the very lowest level, you have muscle movements that have to be controlled. But if you have this kind of an architecture, the advantage is that you can reuse. So these policies can be reused, and the transition dynamics can be reused to solve other tasks. Like instead of going to the market, maybe you're going to visit a friend. So you can reuse a lot of these components, these sub routines for those particular tasks as well. And also evolutionarily, it makes sense because evolution tends to build on top of what is already there. So if evolution found, or I guess if organisms are benefiting from a cortical architecture where, you know, there's this you know, state transition and policy function that are already existing, then you may want to build on top of that by having something that operates on top of an existing cortical area, right? So add a new cortical area that then operates on top of it. So that would be essentially something like this, where the higher levels can benefit from the lower levels already, you know, operating in a particular way in terms of like being able to execute some lower level primitive actions. So here's how we suggested this could work from a mathematical or, you know, computational point of view, which is any level has both the state transition function, this is the world model of the dynamics of the world, state action to the next state. And then each of those states feeds to the policy at that level and gets a suggested action. This is the action here at time t. And this tau is basically another time scale at the lower level. So lower levels are running at a faster time scale in this particular model where they have to complete before the higher level takes over. And what is the higher level doing? Well, it's doing exactly the same thing. So it also has its state transition function. It has its policy or action selection function. But the states and actions at the higher level, so think of this as a population vector or population of neurons, they're modulating the functions of the network at the lower level, right? So basically this H of S is a feedback connections from the higher level to the lower level, and it is modulating the dynamics of what is being computed at the lower level, and that's what the circle represents. So you can think of higher level state and action vectors as essentially generating or modulating the lower level state and action functions at the lower level. So in AI, it's something called hypernetworks. So you may have heard of hypernetworks as neural networks that generate, given an input vector, they generate a whole other neural network, right? So they're generating the parameters, the weights of a whole other neural network. The brain can do that. It cannot generate on the fly a whole neural network, but what it can do is an alternate way of implementing hypernetworks, which is modulation. So you can modulate the dynamics of the neural networks here. And the advantage here is that complex dynamics and complex actions can be essentially abstracted into, you know, this higher level states and actions. So you have a sequence of simpler dynamics at the lower level. So you can compose complex dynamics using simpler dynamics. You can compose complex actions using simpler, more primitive actions using this kind of an architecture, which seems to be one way of modeling the hierarchy in the cortex is in terms of this particular kind of architecture. And so can the brain really do this? So just a couple of ways in which you could potentially do this. So back in 2019 in Nature Neuroscience, Yang et al. Showed that if you have the same architecture of a higher level vector being fed as a modulatory input to a recurrent neural network, then the same recurrent neural network can do a bunch of tasks. So this is basically task-dependent neural network modulation. So depending on the rule inputs, they called it rule inputs, so different rules, up to 20 different rules fed as a one hot vector to this recurrent neural network, the network changes its dynamics and does and solves a whole other different task, the same neural network, right? That's one way in which you can do this top-down control or top-down modulation. Another one is called gain modulation. So again, in Nature Neuroscience in 2018, Stroud et al. Showed that if you change the gain of the input-output function of neurons in a recurrent neural network like this at the top, if you change the input-output gain, and this can be done, for example, with neuromodulators or even the top-down inputs coming to the apical dendrites of cortical neurons, then you can change the gain of the input-output function. That in turn changes the dynamics. So these are the dynamics of cortical neurons in their model. You can change the dynamics. So again, there's two different ways in which one could implement this kind of a hierarchy of higher levels modulating the dynamics of the lower levels. And I'll give you a very quick overview. So there's evidence for predictive state networks. So that's the state transition dynamics network. So there's evidence going back to 2002 of in the visual cortex, predictive activity happening in the visual cortex, in the parietal cortex. Even before an eye movement, the brain prepares itself, or the cortex prepares itself for the eye movement with this predictive activity. They call this predictive remapping in the old literature. More recently, in the auditory cortex of mice, Audit et al. Showed that when the animal is trained to press a lever to get some reward based on, it gets an auditory stimulus based on pressing a lever, the animal learns to predict the particular auditory stimulus even before, there's activity in the auditory cortex, like this ramping activity, even before the animal presses the lever, right? Before the actual movement happens. So it learns to map its, voluntary movement to the expected sensory stimulus, which in this case is an auditory stimulus. And that's what this graph over here shows. So the animal learns to predict based on the consequences of its actions. It learns to predict that. Finally, the right-hand side is the policy networks, right? So the most famous examples of these policy networks are in the motor cortex. So going back to Churchland et al., Krishna Shenoy's lab showed that when the monkey, in this case, a monkey is making these reaching movements, a center-out task, there are these dynamics that happen in the motor cortex, which are mapped here into a low-dimensional principal component space. There are these rotational dynamics you see, and they modeled it using a dynamical system that looks like this. At the very bottom, you can see the action is the motor cortex activity, and it's a function of previous actions you've taken, or the motor cortical activity, as well as some control inputs. And that's basically can be implemented using this motor module that we have in this APC network, right? Which is, again, predicting the next action based on the previous action, as well as some inputs that are coming in. And it also is consistent with more recent work in mice showing that you have this rotational dynamics again, but in this case, you see it both in the cortex and in the thalamus, this kind of a rotational dynamics that are driving the dynamics of this kind of motor network, which we're suggesting is in the deeper layers of the cortex, this kind of a next action prediction network. All right, so let's see, how are we doing on time? So yeah, I guess I have about 10 minutes left, is that right?
You have all the time you want because you're taking questions as you go on.
Okay, so, but yeah, please do stop me. I mean, this could be, I'm going to show examples of how, the same exact architecture, the same network can solve a diverse array of tasks, because that was the original claim, right? I began the talk by saying any putative model of the cortex needs to explain how it can solve all the amazing things that the cortex is said to solve, right? So things ranging from visual perception all the way to language, right? So can something like this start to solve some of those problems? Not completely, obviously, but at least, can it be used to solve, right, those kinds of problems? And that's what I'm going to show from simulations or computer simulations here, is how we've approached that problem, right? So, so I think maybe you can interrupt me as I go along with these examples. Now that I've laid the mathematical foundation, I'm just going to show how we can start to solve, for example, active vision or active perception, right? So how do we use eye movements to figure out what we're looking at, right? And how do we use eye movements to select where to look and then accomplish a particular task, right? So on the left-hand side is like a two-level network. So here's the higher level, capital F of S is the higher level state transition function. The lower level one is given here. It's just two levels of this hierarchy. On the right-hand side is the actions you take. And so what are the actions here? So the actions are where to look next. So you're making eye movements. You have to decide where to look next. On the left-hand side is what am I seeing right now, right? So those are the states. So those will encode what is the current object that I'm looking at, right? Or the part of the object that I'm looking at. Depending on the level of the hierarchy, you may be looking at a part of the object or like the whole object itself. And so what does this look like if it's a two-level hierarchy? So on the right-hand side, I've just shown how, at the higher level, you can select some region of the scene to look at. So this is just a standard, toy model of an MNIST. So again, this is, a standard kind of a simple visual stimulus that people have used. So if you're trying to recognize the digits, in this case, these are handwritten digits of numbers from 0 to 9, right? What we're suggesting here is that the higher level can look at a bigger region. So this is the scale is different. The receptive fields are now bigger at the higher level. That's this higher level here. But once you select a region to look at, the lower level can then go into that region and look at more, higher resolution regions of the image and make eye movements. And then the eye movements lead to some predictions of what to expect. So once it has learned to predict different, in this case, different digits, right? Then it can predict what it's going to see when it makes an eye movement, right? And that's what's shown over here is it predicts and looks at the prediction errors, and then it corrects its predictions, right? So initially it will be predicting wrong images, but then over time it learns to predict what it expects to see. So if it thinks it's a 5, then it moves down below. It has to see this line segment here. But if it makes an eye movement to the top, it has to see this horizontal line segment at the top, and that's what it predicts, right? In terms of the sensory state network, right? So, and how do you train this? So the left-hand side, the state networks are trained to minimize prediction error through gradient descent. The right-hand side, in this case, was trained to minimize the task loss, which could be like classification of the digit, or it could be even reconstruction. So suppose you want to reconstruct the whole digit, that could be like a reconstruction error. So that could be the task loss. And so we were doing it using reinforcement learning. So we just use a standard reinforcement learning algorithm to train these two policy networks, one at the top and one at the bottom, right?
Can I ask you a question about what the underlying task is?
Yeah.
This segment localization, you're trying to find a certain feature, or is it pattern recognition and you really want to know what the whole thing is?
Sorry, I wasn't clear. So it is pattern recognition. So basically, it's, at the higher level, you're recognizing the whole object. That's this capital R of T here. So each of these capital R, think of it as a population of neurons or a vector that characterizes, one of these 10 digits. And initially, you don't know which of the digits it is that you're looking at. But as you move around by moving your sensor, so there's a small sensor here that is like the fovea that you're moving around. This gets up, the higher level vector gets updated based on prediction errors at the lower level. So it's propagated all the way to the top of this hierarchy. And so it is pattern recognition. So after it makes several movements, it should converge to what it believes it's perceiving. So it's object perception. Yeah.
The reason that well, there's a few reasons. You mentioned earlier, just passingly, about the body. And it's not, I mean, yes, I know there's a big movement for embodiment, and I'm fond of it too because of grounding. But it's actually just action. It's just, in order to get your model relevant, you have to have something done and then feedback from the consequences of what it was done.
Yes.
And for that, I have to say something in praise of someone that I don't usually describe in an admiring way. The trouble with B.F. Skinner was that he dismissed mechanisms. He wasn't interested in finding a causal explanation of what happens, but he did isolate the relevant factors, which is action, consequences of action, and the reinforcement is whether it has the expected or desired outcome or not. And that's your model.
Yes.
His model, actually. And that's also why I said it's reinforcement learning in the end. It all boils down to reinforcement learning.
Yes. So I think if you cast, so one of the things that I haven't mentioned is, okay, what do we mean by task loss or maximize? So the way that we did this here was, we actually made the reward be essentially the prediction error, right? So we said if you're predicting correctly where you're going, then that can be looked at as a good thing, right? If your goal is to, for example, get a good reconstruction of the image, so then that becomes like a reward. So the lower the prediction error, the bigger the quote unquote reward, right? And you can use that to train your action networks here, right? So you can essentially look at this, if your expectations are met, that is essentially like a reinforcement learning, right? So that's I think what you're suggesting also, right? So I think I totally agree. Yeah, you can look at it that way. In fact, that's what we used here to train the networks, was to make sure that it predicts properly, right? And you can use that to train these action networks. So I think this example, this video here makes it a little bit more clear, which is, what I'm showing here is on the left-hand side is the model's perception, right? This is what the model thinks is out there in the world. On the right-hand side, you can see two levels of eye movements or movements, like body movements, right? So this one over here, the one in the middle is the higher level. So you can see there's a bigger part of the image being sampled. But within each of these bigger parts, there's these smaller eye movements being made at the lower level. And that's shown on the right-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see both the actual image it's seeing as well as the prediction of the network at the lower level of what it expects to see. And you can see over time, it's actually a pretty good prediction of what it expects to see, right? So this is what it has learned to predict. And once it learns to predict this properly, the prediction errors go to zero or close to zero. But initially, there's big prediction errors when it doesn't know what it is. So you can see on the left-hand side, what we're doing is reconstructing what the model thinks it is seeing, right? That's from the higher level state vector. There's a decoder that predicts what the model thinks it's seeing. And you can see initially there's this blurry kind of prediction and doesn't know what it's seeing, but then over time it gets better and better, right? And another interesting observation here is, there's that perennial question that people ask in, our undergrad classes teaching perception is, hey, we make all these eye movements 3 per second, but why is the world so stable, right? So why do we perceive the world as stable when my head moves and my eyes move and so on? And this suggests an explanation, which is that, this is your percept of the world, and it's stable because it's a Bayesian, it's accumulating the evidence, right? So you have a hypothesis, and then all you're doing with your eye movements is, you are making the eye movements. So it's a voluntary eye movement. And so you can predict what's going to happen. And if it matches what's going to happen, your prediction of what's going to happen, then that's, the prediction error is used as a way to update your hypotheses. But if it's a good prediction, then you don't update it, right? So it basically maintains a stable hypothesis of what it's seeing over time, right? And so it gives an explanation for, again, this stable perception, problem, right? Of how do movements not give you a jittery, perception of the world. And that's another interesting observation here. But is this clear? I mean, I guess this example just showing how you can do active vision with this kind of an architecture.
Your image of active vision is sort of a moving organism and things out there that are stable, and then sort of figuring out what their shapes are from while you're moving. But what about a more general question, which is where there's no movement involved, it's just feature recognition, where there are consequences of getting the feature right or wrong, but not motion consequences and not sequential consequences. Does this fit there too, or are you married to continuous processes, homeostatic-like continuous processes?
Yeah, so I think there is a special case of this, which is basically having like a no op action that you could use, where then it's just learning sequences, or it's doing like if it's a static image, then it could just be doing like a convergence to the best hypotheses, which was the original predictive coding model, was basically that, right? There was no actions, and you just showed a feature, or you showed an image, and it converges to its best hypothesis just through the dynamics of the network. So I would think of that as a special case. In some cases, I would think of that as a very unnatural case of what animals tend to do, because animals, I would say, in the natural state are always using eye movements. It's very rare that you're even staring at something, right? Even when you're staring at, if it's a static scene, you're always making eye movements. And so I would say that it's not the most naturalistic state. So maybe in many cases, maybe we are studying like a unnatural state of the world. It's useful to get some of the primitives that underlie the more active kind of perception that we do. But this particular model, like I said, the special case of the model, when you make the actions be like no op actions, right? It does learn then to process scenes, even in the case where there's no movements, right? So that's one answer, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's also a visual-centered model that you have. I mean, it's very much like it really considers vision and navigating a world with your eyes to be.
Well, I haven't talked about the other examples yet. So this is the visual perception example, right? So I can move on to the other ones, and maybe we can have a discussion about that afterwards.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. I just thought the visual one was like the most easy to kind of convey first. So basically, the other advantage of this is something that Jeff Hinton has been trying to do for a long time with his capsule networks and other kinds of neural networks, which is, can we learn a part-whole hierarchy, right? And so just as an aside, I'll mention that this kind of a way of sampling and understanding the world gives you almost for free, right? It gives you this kind of a hierarchy of parts and subparts and sub-subparts and so on. And not only that, but it also gives you, the network learns basically that a complex object is composed of simpler objects, but it also, because it's making eye movements to locations within the reference frame of the object, you can then learn the locations of where these parts can be found. So it learns both a what and a where, right? So it basically learns where are these parts of the object, what are the subparts, but also within the reference frame of that subpart, where are these subparts, right? So things like that. So that's like a nice feature of this kind of a model is, it gives you this kind of part-whole hierarchy as part of the learning process that it learns. So here's example number 2, which is, we can use the same exact architecture with the hierarchy of state networks and the hierarchy of action networks and the two interacting with each other. You can use it to solve, complex planning problems, right? So here's a classic reinforcement learning planning problem, a big world with, walls. So the gray are supposed to be walls, and then there's a blue agent trying to reach some goal, green location, which is a goal, and so on. So you could use reinforcement learning to figure out the best actions to take to get to the goal. The goal could be changing, the start location could be changing, and so on. That's standard reinforcement learning, right? And you do that to trial and error, right? You keep trying, and you eventually get to the goal, and you get a reward, and so on. What we're suggesting is, if you've already learned some primitives, like for example, let's say you've learned that this environment is composed of these kinds of building blocks. So these are the higher level states. You can call them rooms or building blocks of more complex environments. And if you've learned to navigate in this simpler environment, so for example, you know how to get from one corner to another corner of this simple world. So simple world number 1 is yellow, simple world number 2 is red. Then what you can notice when you're put in a complex environment is you can try to solve the complex planning problem by chaining together or composing a new solution to this complex problem. So you can basically use this higher level action 1. So that's like a goal of going from this location to that location. That's 1. From here, you can then again plan to go from this yellow this location to the 2 location, number 2, and then from there you can go to number 3, and you can compose these higher level actions A1, A2, and A3. So in effect, you can plan at the higher level using abstract actions, and this mimics how we would as humans plan as well, right? So we don't plan our muscle movements. We actually plan the higher level goals and sub goals, and this is basically mimicking that. Assuming you've learned how to move your muscles, then you can use those higher level actions to then guide yourself to particular states of the world, or in this case, particular locations, right? So that's the idea behind planning using higher level states. And you can see how this exact idea can be implemented with our network, because this is basically policies at the lower level, and these higher level actions are the actions at the higher level, right? The action vectors. Same thing for the dynamics, right? The state dynamics would be only modeling this kind of a state of the world, like these two particular parts. So each of these would be modeled by lower level, state transition functions, these two. But then the higher level would generate, because remember the higher level generates through these hyper networks or modulation. It generates the lower level states. So that would be this state transition function and this state transition function, depending on where it is. So you can again model the dynamics of this more complex world as a sequence. So in this case, a sequence of yellow, and red, right? That sequence can be modeled at the higher level as well. So the state transition would model, I'm in this location right now, this higher level location, I'm in this abstract location, and I'm in this red abstract location, right? So it's almost like schemas. You can think of them as schemas where you're saying, okay, this part of the world can be modeled by this schema, this part of the world can be modeled by this other schema, the red schema. So there's a yellow schema and the red schema, right? So that's the idea. And so I'll just give you a quick run through of, if you run this, you do some planning. So this is basically model predictive control. So you run into the future, you say, okay, what happens if I take action number 4 at the higher level versus action number 3? And then these are all your chains of thought, right? You're sort of going forward in time and seeing, does any of these set of actions as I do planning give me a reward? And hey, you notice, okay, I'm actually getting a good reward here, because if my goal is to go from this blue location to the green location, then these higher level actions will lead me to the reward. And so I'm going to reward this action, the action number A3, the higher level action A3, more than I do this higher level action A4. So you can do this kind of a forward projection of your actions and states and do higher level planning. And so we did that, and you get these kinds of lower level trajectories, because you already know how to go from one sub goal to another sub goal in this sort of compositional way. And then finally, you can sort of just run some tests of, okay, if you only use lower level planning, then you obviously take a lot more planning steps. The higher level is a much more efficient way of planning. So the distance from goal is shown at the bottom, and then this is the number of planning steps. And you can see, obviously, there's a win if you just do a higher level planning. Similarly, if you just do reinforcement learning with a standard reinforcement learning agent, when the goal changes from this green location to some other green location at the top or to the right and so on, then you have to relearn the policy, obviously, for reinforcement learning. But because you're doing higher level planning, you can keep getting the reward. So these are episodic rewards for each time your goal changes. And these are the episodes, right? So you can basically continue to gain reward as you don't have to relearn the policy, right? So basically you're using your basis, your lower level policies, and just recomposing the sequence of policies you use to get to the new goal. And that's what you're doing over here. Yeah, so let's see, how am I doing on time here? So I just want to conclude with a couple of other examples. So I'll just throw these in there and then we can have a discussion. So one is, I always get asked, okay, what's the role of memory, right? And obviously there's memory in these predictive coding networks and the weights and the connections of between neurons of the network. But what about at the top of the hierarchy, right? So the top of the hierarchy, you have the hippocampus. And that's been traditionally associated with, memory of episodes and things like that. And the interesting thing is it's not just a one-way street. The cortex, sends information to the hippocampus, but the hippocampus sends information back to the cortex, right? So what is that doing? Why is it sending information back? So some people have said, it's useful for replay, right? That's one function is, there's a replay that hippocampus does of, past episodic memories and so on for training the cortical network. That's one thing. But in the context of predictive coding, you can also think of it as enabling better predictions, right? So the cortex can only do so much with its recurrent neural networks. But if the hippocampus at the top is maintaining context of what happened in the current episode, then these feedback connections can really guide the predictions at all the different cortical areas, saying, that this is what happened in the past, right? So that's the idea here. And so we've done some preliminary experiments where we've attached something like a Hopfield network, some kind of an associative memory at the top that takes the inputs from the state and action networks at the top of the hierarchy and then stores it like over time. So it's from time step 1 all the way to the current time step. And then it feeds it back to the state and action networks when it encounters new inputs. And that helps to guide the predictions. And you can also do recall, right, across all the different cortical areas. So for example, if you give a starting image, so we've trained it, for example, in this case, to memorize the episodic memory consists of the 5 moving from left to right. So this 5 moves from left to right. And if that's what is in the memory, then if you give it only this very first image, that's like a cue to the memory, comes from the cortical network to the hippocampus network. And then that generates the whole vector storing the episodic memory. And then that in turn guides the lower level predictions. So we've done some experiments comparing it to some data from rodents as well. And that's more details are found in this PLOS CompBio paper if you're interested in this kind of hippocampus guided predictions in the predictive coding framework. And then finally, I'll just leave you with this, which is, Steve asked about, okay, is this only a vision-centric framework? We're only starting to look at other kinds of more abstract kind of representation. So the hypothesis, if you recall, is, if the laminar structure of the cortex is similar across areas and modalities, then this kind of a model, this APC model, should be also applicable to language understanding, right? So we looked at, again, thanks to Montreal, Mila, there's a baby AI platform that Mila researchers have open sourced. So we're using that to test this idea that maybe you could combine language understanding with vision-based tasks. So if you have this kind of a grid world and there's objects, so you are this red triangle, that's the agent. There's these blue locations. There could also be keys. There could be boxes that you can open, or there's doors and so on. So you could have language commands that are simple, like go to the blue ball, which is, you have to figure out what the goal is and you have to go to the blue ball. Or it could be more complex, like put the blue key next to the green ball, right? So put the blue key next to the green ball and so on. So it has to go there, pick it up, go and press. So there's all these interesting language commands as well as vision-based tasks. And so it has to understand the language words. These words are tokens of language. And so we've just started exploring this idea. And so just to give an idea of how it fits into the APC network. So if you recall, the state network was storing the state of the world. In this case, the state of the world is, what sentence am I listening to right now, right? So somebody's speaking to you and there's a sentence coming in word by word, right? So the words are coming in. And as you're processing those words, remember it's a hierarchical network. The higher level is basically estimating the higher level state, which is basically like the, if you recall in the vision example, you had a higher level object you're trying to process, and you're getting these image patches by moving your eye movements, right? Making your eye movements. And over time, you learn to parse and recognize the object, right? You're saying, okay, it's not a 9, it's actually a 4 because I've gotten these particular images by making eye movements, right? So that's very similar to what's shown on the left-hand side. So if the sentence is open the yellow door, then this network has been trained to process each of these individual words separately. So when open the yellow door happens, you start off in this space. This is basically the higher level state vector. I'll be projecting it down to a 3-dimensional space for visualization. You can see how everything starts at the same location, but then it diverges once you start saying the word open the and then red. So open the is in the beginning part, but the red door diverges to up here, and then green door goes here, and then the open the purple door, and so on. So they start to separate to different locations in this high-dimensional state space at the higher level. So what we're suggesting is the higher level state vector is capturing the entire sentence, and the lower level is capturing the dynamics. The state transition function is predicting the next word and the next word and the next word and so on. And that's how you can then gather the evidence of language, and then you can parse it and have a higher level goal vector that is now being used. So you can use that to then guide the agent. So once you understand the word, the sentence, that is open the yellow door, then this agent can then implement the action. So that is the second part of the network is, you have a higher level policy that gives you a lower level, a set of actions that then take you to this particular door and opens that yellow door, right? So that's what's shown at the bottom here. So that's something we're just starting to do, is translate language into action as well, right? So I hope that was clear. And then the very last slide I have is going beyond language. I mean, what about higher level cognition? So we were very intrigued. So this is something we have not done yet, but just to show like a potential application here. Suppose your goal is to learn an abstract concept such as a family tree. So family tree is an abstract concept, but then you can apply it to many different families, right? So this is going back to what is called the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine. So we were inspired by their model. This is Whittington et al. And Tim Behrens and others back in 2020. So what they showed is that you can again model using a recurrent neural network. So in our case, this would be the state network at any particular level. If you have abstract actions, you can think of them as internal action that the brain is using to guide its navigation of some abstract concept. So you can basically move from one abstract location to another abstract location. So in this case, you can go from, for example, this node where you're considering some person. And if the action is, okay, who's the uncle of, Bob, right? So maybe this is Bob, and you're saying, okay, who's the uncle of Bob? So you basically be navigating this tree over here to go to this person, because that's basically your parent's brother, right? So here's your parent B, and that's your brother. So you could basically do this kind of a navigation by using actions, right? So actions are, again, very central. It's just that the actions are not in the external world. The actions are internal to the brain. And so you can think of them as internal actions. And that may be one way in which you can model, a lot of cognitive phenomena, right? So we haven't explored this yet, but I'm just suggesting that as a potential future direction. So anyways, I'll conclude with a summary. So basically, at a very high level, we're looking at the neocortex as a Bayesian estimator of the world that maintains a generative model of the world, an internal model. And specifically, we're saying that sensory and motor processes are very intimately tied within each cortical area. So it's not like, there's only sensory areas of the cortex and only motor areas of the cortex, but seems like every cortical area is getting both sensory and motor information is being produced by every cortical area. And we suggested that, we showed how you can use the same architecture to do a whole bunch of different things like active perception or part whole learning and so on, and maybe even potentially concept learning if we can, get to that particular example at some point. But then, there's a lot of open questions. And so right now we're trying to understand the interactions between cortical areas as well as subcortical structures like the thalamus, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the superior colliculus, and so on. So a lot of really interesting questions that are still to be explored. So a lot of unknowns, much remains to be tested. And, definitely welcome your feedback. Your criticisms would be very much, appreciated. Some publications, if you're interested in diving deeper into our, models here. So there's a Nature Neuroscience paper and some PLOS-Comp bio neural computation papers as well, and this PNS Nexus one on the right side. Definitely couldn't have done any of this without my students and a postdoc. So quite grateful to them, and also my past collaborators and the funding sources that have helped fund this research. And please do visit us in Seattle if you can. So it's again another nice and sunny and relatively warm day in Seattle. So grateful for that. So thank you again, and I'd appreciate your questions. Thank you.
It's open and what usually, yes, here we go.
All right.
1 second. Go ahead. And then I recognize 2 questions here. Tell me, Raj, if it's loud enough for you from here.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the talk. My name is Yasmin. Actually, I'm serious about the future work that you mentioned in the conclusion, the last slide.
Yeah.
As I understood from today's talk, is about predictive coding frames cognition as hierarchical generative prediction of sensory input and action outcomes. So how do you think this framework extends to abstract reasoning and symbolic thought are less directly grounded in sensory prediction?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, this was kind of my attempt to get at that question. So like I said, we haven't done this part of the model, simulations or testing yet. But the hope is that for more abstract concepts, in this case, this was this family tree concept. But the idea was that, you could still use sensory feedback, right? So in this case, this is basically taken from the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine paper. What they did was, there was this abstract learning of using a recurrent neural network. You're learning what it means to be a particular node in this family tree. And then the hippocampus is being used to do binding, right? So you're binding an actual sensory input, right, to the abstract concept. So for example, if this node over here, right, this cross node over here corresponds to, in the current case, a specific person in your family, right, in a particular family, then the other nodes would be bound to the corresponding people, like the parent of that person, the uncle of that person, the grandparent of the person, and so on. The particular names and the features would be bound to that using the sensory part, right, of the cortex. So this is basically a way to bind abstract concepts with particular instantiations of that particular person. And so you can still use prediction errors because, when you are trying to learn the concept, you make a prediction. That's what this arrow shows, is you're saying, okay, I think the uncle of this person, Bob, is, Peter, right? But then Peter maybe is a grandfather, right? So then you get a prediction error in this space, and you can actually use the prediction error, propagate it through this network, to then update this function, the state transition function, which is a recurrent network here, to change its prediction so that the next time, you have that action, okay, go to the uncle of, Bob, right? Then it'll predict the right person. It'll not predict this A, it'll predict the C, right? And C is bound to that particular person because of this hippocampal, binding, right? So that would be how you would model, more abstract learning and abstract. So it could still be like a prediction, but it has to be done at sort of a higher level, like an abstract level, right? And sort of you can think of this as a schema, right, if you want to call it that. But it is a harder problem, right? It's not as simple as sensory consequences of action. It's more of a, you're doing it at a higher level. So I hope that answers it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Rajesh. You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
On my side, I am interested in the role of white matter, my thesis. And your framework seems really relevant. I explained certain types of autism correlate with hyperconnectivity of short-range connections and hypoconnectivity of long-range connections. And in terms of behavior, these correlates with they are better at lower level tasks, like salient sensory stimuli detection that require reduced timescales. And conversely, they are better, they are worse performance, for example, in planning abilities. So do you think your hypothesis of your generative hierarchical system could explain these differences in neural white matter patterns and social cognition disorders? Thanks. It's my first question. Maybe I have a second one after.
No, thank you so much. So that's a very important problem. And, it's something that I or my lab has not personally gone into, but I know that there's a lot of work in the predictive coding literature where people have, formulated models relevant to autism and, the underlying physiological and anatomical implications of that, and connecting that to what could be happening from a predictive coding style perspective. I think, I mean, like you said, I mean, there's there's deficiencies in planning and so on. What this model allows you to do is, maybe you can formulate that in terms of, like you said, connections, long-range connections versus shorter connections within cortical areas versus longer range, white matter, connections. And so at least you can start to test some of those ideas, because like I suggested, having this kind of a hierarchical decomposition of a task, for example, planning would involve you being able to compose new solutions to a problem based on what you've already learned. And if you're not able to then compose those particular actions at the higher level, maybe you're stuck with only the lower level policies, which are these lower level action networks, which are it could be like habits, right? So you can think of the lower level as networks as habits that are very well learned, but they're they're able to perform certain reflexive type of behaviors, but maybe it's harder to then compose them to then form a solution to a more complex problem. So it's something that we haven't looked at, but hopefully something like this model where you have all the potentially useful components. Like there's one component which is the perception that is happening in a cortical area in terms of state estimation, and then there's also an action component relevant to that cortical area at that level of abstraction, right? So there's both perception and action involved, and then there's also a hierarchy, right? So hopefully having those pieces will help, maybe at least suggest some new hypotheses about these kinds of like autism and other kinds of disorders. But yeah, I think a lot of interesting questions that could be explored and hopefully have some implications and predictions. Yeah. So thank you.
Go ahead. Une minute avant la deuxième question.
Yeah, oui,
Go ahead.
Thanks for your answer. So my second question was a bit linked to this one. So we know also that the prefrontal cortex, but especially the prefrontal cortex evolves really slowly and becomes mature really late in the development. So I was wondering if predictive coding research, such as yours, take into account these neuromorphic aspects of development. Do you think it's relevant to create a generative hierarchical model that develops gradually following the developmental trajectory of human-like development? Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, again, in terms of the hierarchy, right? So I think one of the things that I didn't talk about much was the learning of the hierarchy, right? So so I think it'll be interesting to think about, okay, how exactly would that happen, right? So I mean, here's just like one of the famous Feldman-Van hierarchy, and starting. So I think this is basically just showing you how it sort of progresses towards the hippocampus and so on, but there's also some frontal areas and so on, right? So one of the, I mean, there's this whole notion of sort of curriculum for learning and training neural networks in AI, and there's some speculation about, okay, you want to train these lower level networks first, and then you build on top of some of the behaviors that are learned. And so maybe what you're suggesting here in terms of developmental processes is that it doesn't make sense to really train some of the higher level, perhaps prefrontal cortex networks that are dependent on the lower level networks for a lot of their representations. Maybe you want to have learning going on at the lower levels that are more rapid. So this gets into this critical period kind of thing where you try to train up your lower level networks quickly when you're infants and when you're a baby and so on, so that the higher levels can then make use of the representations and also the policies or these action subroutines that you've learned, right? So I think it fits with that kind of a picture, and it makes sense computationally as well, that you want to make sure that you're learning on top of stable representations. I mean, you don't completely cut off learning at the lower levels, but then you allow there to be enough primitives at the lower level that you can then use at the higher level. So if you believe prefrontal cortex is doing a lot of planning or other higher level, more abstract reasoning tasks, then maybe it's building on top of lower level networks that are lower in the hierarchy that are then providing the compositional primitives, right, that the higher level can then leverage and put together like a sequence of these lower level primitives to then model some new phenomena or solve a more complex task with a sequence of more primitive actions or action sequences. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time. So all I can do is thank you very much for coming all the way over here in this weather. And you've given us a very convincing sketch of how predictive encoding can handle problems that are in any way analogous to homeostasis or navigation. I'd be interested to see where it applies to, for example, we're talking about abstract. I mean, it's not enough to say that I'm going to give an abstract problem. The real problem of abstraction in language, how do you connect words to their reference in the world?
Yep.
And that means category learning. So
Yeah.
I'll be interested to see how predictive coding can help with that.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be great. That's something that we want to do, and I think it's a great motivation, I think. So yeah, thanks for the feedback, and I'm looking forward to more interactions and more feedback. So feel free to email me as well. You can find me on my website, the email address. So yeah, anybody interested, they can.
I have a set of questions from the students that I'm going to be sending you today.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay, bye-bye, and thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity. Okay, see y'all.